Imagine stepping back in time to a world that looks familiar at first glance, but quickly starts to feel like a stage play where everyone is performing non-stop. That's Victorian England for you. A place where life wasn't just lived, it was choreographed. From the moment people opened their eyes in the morning until they finally tucked themselves into bed at night, almost every action carried some kind of hidden meaning. To us, it might seem silly, even exhausting, but for them it was survival. Think of it like being part of a never-ending play, where the script was written by etiquette books and the audience was made up of your neighbors, your relatives, and sometimes even complete strangers passing you on the street. The Victorians lived in a time when appearances weren't just important, they were everything. Reputation was currency. You didn't just show people who you were, you showed them what you wanted them to think of you, and you had to keep that image spotless. A loud laugh at the wrong moment, a bit of untidy clothing, even yawning before breakfast, any of those could spark whispers and side-eyed looks that might follow you for weeks. And when gossip spread, it spread like wildfire. In neighborhoods where everyone knew each other's business, one mistake could cost you invitations, friendships, even marriage prospects. That was the kind of pressure people woke up to every single day. Now, why were they like this? It wasn't just that they were naturally uptight or overly dramatic. Victorian society grew out of enormous change. The Industrial Revolution had transformed England, especially its cities. People were moving in from the countryside in droves, factories were popping up, and suddenly you weren't living in a small town where everyone knew you since childhood. You were living in crowded streets full of strangers, and how do you judge a stranger? You can't ask about their life story, you don't have time. Instead, society built up a new system, one based on visible signals. How someone dressed, how they walked, how they spoke. All those little things became ways to instantly decide, is this person respectable or not? It was a kind of social shortcut, and though it was flawed, it gave people a sense of order in a chaotic world. Respectability was the word of the day. It wasn't enough to just be kind or honest. You had to look the part too. That meant keeping yourself clean, your clothes neat, and your manners polished to perfection. Sobriety, thrift, and cleanliness were considered proof that you were moral. If you slipped up, even in a small way, you risked being labeled as careless, weak, or untrustworthy. And once that label stuck, good luck shaking it. So, people worked hard to protect their image, covering up flaws, hiding anything that might be judged as improper, and constantly measuring themselves against the invisible yardstick of respectability. Think of it like living in a world where you're being graded all the time. Not just in school, but at breakfast, at church, at the market, even just walking down the street. Did you sit the right way? Did you use the right spoon? Did you look at someone for just the right amount of time? Long enough to be polite, but not so long that it was seen as forward. Everything became a test. And unlike a real test, there wasn't a clear answer sheet. You had to figure out the rules as you went, and sometimes the rules changed depending on who was watching. What's both fascinating and a little sad is that a lot of natural, human behavior had to be suppressed. Sneezing, laughing too loudly, showing frustration, even just walking briskly. All those things were considered suspicious or even scandalous. Imagine going through your day trying to hold in your natural reactions, worried that if you slipped up, people would think less of you. No wonder the Victorians developed all kinds of elaborate ways to cover up, redirect, or disguise what they were really feeling. Their society demanded constant self-control. But here's the thing, it wasn't all just vanity. Beneath the starch and the rules there was fear. The Victorians lived in uncertain times. Industrial cities were crowded and dirty, disease was common, and the old ways of life were slipping away. When you don't have much control over the big things, like whether your job will be safe or whether the water you're drinking is clean, you look for control in the small things. Etiquette gave them that. It was a way to create order where everything else felt unstable. A spotless reputation couldn't protect you from illness or poverty, but it could keep you in good standing with your community. In a way, etiquette was their armor, and they wore that armor every day. Even small gestures became symbolic. A bow wasn't just a bow, it was a statement of respect. Sitting upright at the table wasn't just about posture, it was a sign that you had discipline. Covering your cough wasn't just about manners, it was proof that you weren't careless or dirty. Every detail became a performance, and everyone knew they were being watched. It was a society built on observation, whispers, and silent judgment. The result: daily life could feel like an obstacle course. You woke up already on guard, ready to play your part. Getting through the day without sparking a scandal wasn't just a relief, it was a victory. Think about that. Today, we might feel good if we check everything off our to-do list. In Victorian England, people felt good if they got through the day without anyone side-eyeing them for using the wrong fork or sneezing twice at breakfast. Now, you might think all this sounds stifling, and you'd be right. But it also created a fascinating culture of codes, signals, and workarounds. Since people couldn't express themselves openly, they got creative. They found ways to communicate feelings through flowers, through the way they folded a calling card, even through how they walked down the street. In a world where saying the wrong thing could sink you, subtlety became an art. It was like living in a giant puzzle where everyone was constantly decoding each other's behavior. This constant awareness shaped not just how people acted, but how they saw the world. They lived in layers, what was shown on the outside and what was hidden underneath. On the surface, everything was polished, polite, and respectable. Beneath that, though, people still had the same frustrations, joys, and longings that we all do. They just had to disguise them under layers of etiquette. And while it's easy for us to laugh at the quirks, like the myths about furniture legs being scandalous, or the endless spoon rules, it's worth remembering that for them, these things mattered deeply. They weren't just silly traditions, they were survival strategies in a world full of uncertainty and judgment. So, when you think of Victorian England, don't just picture stiff collars and stern faces. Picture a society doing its best to cope with change, using rules and rituals to make sense of a chaotic world. Picture people who wanted belonging, respect, and stability, and who found those things, however imperfectly, in the language of etiquette. And here's the fun part. We're only just scratching the surface. We've set the stage, introduced the players, and peeked behind the curtain of this grand performance. But the real stories are still waiting. The corsets, the breakfasts, the parlours, the endless rituals, all of that is coming up. For now, just imagine waking up in a world where every move mattered, where every detail had weight, and where simply surviving the day with your dignity intact was an accomplishment. That's the world we're stepping into tonight. The day in Victorian England didn't really begin with sunlight peeking through the curtains or the clatter of a carriage outside. It began with fabric, layers of it, mountains of it. Before you even thought about breakfast or stepping outside, you had to dress. And dressing wasn't just about putting on clothes. It was a daily performance, a declaration of respectability, and for many, a battle of endurance. For men, getting dressed was fussy but manageable shirts, waistcoats, cravats tied with the precision of a sailor's knot, trousers creased just so, and coats that somehow made you look important even if you weren't. But for women, it was an entirely different ordeal. Imagine trying to face your day while wrapped like a Christmas present in fabric, steel, and whalebone. That was the corset, the centerpiece of Victorian fashion. A corset wasn't something you slipped into on your own. Oh no, this was a two-person job. Picture it you, standing stiff as a board, holding onto a bedpost like you're preparing for a storm, while someone, maybe your mother, maybe your maid, pulls the laces tighter and tighter. The room is quiet except for the creak of fabric and the occasional gasp as your ribs protest. It's not quick, It's not comfortable, it's a ritual. Every tug of the laces pulled you closer to that fashionable hourglass shape, but further from the ability to take a deep breath. And yet, it wasn't optional. A corset wasn't just clothing. It was proof. Proof that you had self-control. Proof that you belonged in respectable society. A loose corset sent a message. Maybe you were lazy. Maybe you were reckless. Too tight. And sure, you might faint at your cousin's wedding, but at least you looked disciplined while doing it. What's wild is that people didn't even admit the health toll. Women fainted constantly, but doctors of the time blamed it on female hysteria, not on the fact that their lungs were being squeezed into submission. So fainting couches became a standard piece of living room furniture, as common as a side table or a chair. Smelling salts weren't just for show, they were survival tools. If you lived in Victorian England, you learned how to faint gracefully, because odds are you'd need to at some point. Once the corset was in place, the rest of the outfit followed: petticoats, crinolines, bustles, skirts so wide you had to turn sideways just to fit through a doorway. And it didn't stop with skirts. Gloves were a must, hats were non-negotiable, jewelry had rules of its own. Even the fabric and color you chose spoke volumes. Velvet at the wrong time of day, too ambitious, too much silk, people might whisper you were showing off. Too much black when you weren't in mourning, downright suspicious. And it wasn't just women feeling the pressure. Men had their own costume dramas. Top hats towering like stovepipes, collars starched so stiff you could barely move your neck, and trousers cut so sharply they might as well have been weapons. Beards and sideburns were treated like accessories, each style carrying a silent message. Bushy sideburns meant power. A neat mustache meant refinement, and being clean-shaven, well, that was often considered childish, or worse, French. Everywhere you went, your outfit announced who you were. Were you wealthy, respectable, trying a little too hard? The judgment came fast. A wrinkled glove could spark gossip. A missing button could hint at carelessness. Even the shine of your shoes mattered. You weren't just dressing for yourself. You were dressing for every single person you'd encounter that day. Now, think about the sheer time it took. Dressing wasn't a 5-minute routine. It was closer to a morning marathon. And by the time you were done, corseted, layered, buttoned, gloved, pinned, and topped with the right hat, you weren't just ready for the day. You were armored against judgment, whispers, and the sharp gaze of that one aunt who seemed to notice everything. Of course, not everyone could keep up. Servants and labourers had simpler clothes, practical ones for long hours of work. But even then, respectability mattered. A maid with an untidy apron could be scolded. A labourer with dirty boots might be thought careless, even if the dirt came from the very work that kept him fed. Clothing wasn't just fashion. It was a measuring stick. And here's the thing, Victorian fashion wasn't just about looking good. It shaped how people lived. Wide skirts meant furniture had to be arranged further apart. Corsets shaped how women sat, how they walked, even how much they could eat at dinner. Clothing literally controlled the body, dictating movement, posture, and sometimes even mood. Imagine trying to laugh or take a big bite of food while your ribs were squeezed into place. No wonder people carried themselves with such stiff dignity. They had no choice. So, as the sun rose on a Victorian morning, you weren't just waking up, you were preparing to step into a role, to wear the uniform of respectability, no matter how uncomfortable it was. And by the time you finally looked in the mirror, pale but polished, breath shallow but posture perfect, you were ready, not for comfort, not for ease, but for performance. Because in Victorian England, getting dressed wasn't about you, it was about everyone else. And that's how the day began, with fabric, steel, and the constant pressure to look the part. The corset was more than clothing. It was a symbol, a statement, and for many, a daily struggle. Yet people endured it, because that was the cost of belonging. The corset is laced, the layers are in place, and now comes the next challenge of the Victorian day breakfast. You might think food would be a moment of comfort, a chance to relax before the day's duties really begin. But in Victorian England, breakfast was anything but relaxing. It wasn't just a meal, it was a test, a daily exam in manners, poise, and silent endurance. If you passed, you made it through another round of respectability. If you failed, well, people would be whispering about your crumb management before noon. Let's start with the setting. Imagine walking into a breakfast room in a wealthy Victorian home. The furniture is polished to a mirror shine. The silver is laid out in perfect symmetry, and the family portrait on the wall seems to glare down, ready to take notes on your performance. Chairs are pulled out in order, but you never sit before the head of the household does. Every movement is measured. Even the way you lower yourself into the chair must be controlled. No flopping, no sighing, just a graceful perch as though the chair might collapse if you put too much faith in it. Then comes the food. And the food for those with money was a spectacle. Forget your quick bowl of cereal or piece of toast. Breakfast could mean bacon, sausage, smoked fish, eggs boiled or fried, porridge, kedgeree, a spiced rice and fish dish from colonial India, and fresh bread stacked like soldiers ready for duty. The table was full not just to feed people, but to show off. Abundance was a way of declaring status. If you could offer variety at breakfast, you could prove your household was thriving. But of course, having the food was only the beginning. Eating it required a choreography that would make a ballet dancer sweat. Napkin first. Place it on your lap, folded neatly, never tucked into your collar. That was for babies and, according to some Americans, then came the silent battle with utensils. Because this wasn't just a fork and knife situation, oh no. At a well-set table, you might face 8 or more pieces of cutlery, each designed for a specific purpose. There was an egg spoon, a porridge spoon, a grapefruit spoon, a dessert spoon, a soup spoon, even a bouillon spoon, just for clear broths. And heaven help you if you chose the wrong one. It wasn't just about using the right spoon, either. It was about how you used it. Toast, for example, had rules. You never buttered it directly on your plate. No scraping sounds, no messy crumbs. You placed it on a side plate, spread the butter in smooth, silent strokes, and lifted it delicately, preferably with silver tongues if they were available. Drop a crumb, and you didn't dare pick it up. To acknowledge imperfection was worse than the imperfection itself. So you ignored it, staring straight ahead as though nothing happened, while everyone else silently clocked the mistake for later gossip. Eggs were their own battlefield. Soft-boiled eggs required the correct egg spoon, a gentle tap on the shell, and no slurping of the yolk. Slurping wasn't just rude. It was considered a sign of moral weakness. Even porridge had its dangers. Stirring too energetically suggested you were either starving or poorly bred. Stirring too little made you look lazy. Somewhere in between, there was a perfect balance, and finding it was part of the exam. Conversation was another minefield. Talking at breakfast wasn't banned, but it was tightly controlled. No politics, no money, no mention of illness, and absolutely nothing about bodily functions. Weather was safe, so was a polite remark about the roses in the garden. But if you ran out of those safe topics, silence was better than risk. Better to sit quietly and nod, pretending to admire the marmalade, than to say something foolish. For children, breakfast was like a training ground for the rest of their social lives. They sat at their own little tables, supervised by a governess, learning how to fold napkins, hold spoons, and keep their voices quiet. Even laughter was discouraged. Imagine being 7 years old staring at porridge and trying not to giggle because your brother made a funny face. That wasn't just mischief, it was a breach of discipline. So children learned early control yourself, even at the table. Now, not everyone lived this way. The poor had simpler meals, maybe just bread and broth, maybe a cheap porridge called gruel. But even in humbler homes, there was pressure to keep some form of dignity at the table. Clean hands, straight posture, quiet eating. Even if the food was meager, manners were meant to carry you through. The contrast between classes showed in the food itself. While the wealthy could afford smoked fish, meats and imported teas. The poor stretched what little they had. But both ends of society shared the same anxiety. How you ate reflected who you were. A sloppy eater, whether rich or poor, was seen as undisciplined, possibly even untrustworthy. Breakfast wasn't just fuel for the body, it was evidence of character. And then there were the little disasters: spilling tea, dropping a knife, sneezing. Each one came with its own set of protocols. Sneezing, for instance, wasn't just an oops. It was practically a social crisis. The proper thing was to stifle it, to cover it instantly with a handkerchief as though it appeared by magic. If you sneezed more than once, you were expected to excuse yourself from the table entirely. Too many sneezes, and you might as well leave the county. Spilled tea required freezing in place, apologizing softly, and hoping the mess vanished without further comment. But it wouldn't. Someone would bring it up later, maybe at the next dinner party, maybe in a letter. Mistakes lingered. By the end of the meal, you weren't nourished in the way we think of today. You might have eaten, yes, but you were also stiff from sitting so straight, tense from watching every move, and exhausted from navigating the invisible web of rules. Breakfast wasn't a gentle start to the day. It was the opening exam in the 24-hour marathon of respectability. And when it was finally over, you rose carefully, chair pushed back quietly, napkin folded neatly on the table. No sudden movements, no sigh of relief. You left the room as controlled as you had entered it, already bracing yourself for the next performance waiting outside those doors. After the ordeal of breakfast, where you've managed to butter toast without scandal and sip your tea without clinking your spoon, you might think you've earned a moment of peace. A hot shower, maybe, something refreshing before you face the rest of the day. Not so fast. In Victorian England, bathing wasn't just inconvenient. It was suspicious. That sounds strange to us now. We're used to showers being quick, private, and almost thoughtless. Step in, turn a knob, adjust the temperature, done. For the Victorians, cleaning your body was never simple. It was a production, one full of labour, superstition, and endless rules about modesty. Washing yourself was less about feeling fresh and more about proving you weren't reckless, immoral, or, heaven forbid, too French. Public bathhouses, for instance, existed, but they carried a whiff of scandal. To step inside one was to risk being associated with vice, questionable company, or worse. Respectable families avoided them unless desperate, which meant the burden fell on the home. But at home, the act of bathing was anything but private or easy. Picture it, you decide you'd like a bath. That decision alone might make people raise their eyebrows. Why? Because bathing too often was thought to excite the nerves. Doctors warned that soaking in water could weaken the body, unleash hidden passions, or invite illness. Still, you press on. You summon your household staff. Or if you don't have staff, you prepare yourself for hours of work. Enormous kettles of water must be boiled, carried upstairs, and poured into a heavy tin tub that sits right in the middle of your bedroom. By the time the water is ready, it's lukewarm at best, and the entire household knows exactly what you're about to do. Privacy is nearly impossible. And then comes modesty. The Victorians were obsessed with it. You couldn't just undress and hop in. No, you slipped behind a folding screen, layered undergarments carefully set aside, curtains drawn tight, doors locked. Heaven help you if a servant accidentally walked in and caught a glimpse of an ankle. That single mistake could fuel gossip for months. Even pets weren't trusted. Some families banished dogs and cats from bedrooms during bathing, just in case their presence somehow compromised propriety. Soap, when you finally got to it, wasn't exactly the silky luxury we think of today. It was rough, harsh, and smelled like something between lie and industrial optimism. Many people preferred to avoid it altogether. A good rub down with a dry towel, they insisted, was healthier and far less risky. Too much soap was almost as suspicious as too little. Being overly clean could suggest vanity, or worse, moral looseness. So the compromise was something called the strip wash. Instead of immersing yourself fully, you undressed in sections, never completely naked, and cleaned yourself bit by bit. Face, neck, hands, maybe behind the ears if you were feeling bold. Anything below the waist, often left for fate and dark clothing to cover. Entire etiquette guides suggested this as the safest path, clean enough to appear respectable, but not so clean that you looked eccentric. For the especially cautious, there was the dry bath. No water at all, just talcum powder, a stiff brush, and a good deal of faith. Powder down your skin, brush yourself briskly and voile. You were as good as new, or at least passably fragrant. And if all else failed, drown yourself in floral cologne. Better to smell like an overstuffed bouquet than to risk someone thinking you had actually sweated. Of course, rules varied depending on class. The wealthy could afford weekly baths, sometimes even daily if they had enough servants to carry the water. Servants and labourers, on the other hand, were often advised to wash as infrequently as possible. Soap and hot water were expensive, and grime, believe it or not, was considered protective. To scrub too clean might make you look like you were aspiring above your station. Dirt was a badge of labour, a kind of invisible uniform, and yet, for all their worries, the Victorians were also fascinated by hygiene. They lived in an age of new medical discoveries, and public health reformers began pushing for more frequent washing. But the old fears lingered. Too much water could weaken the constitution. Too much soap might inflame the skin. Too much exposure might corrupt morals. It was a balancing act, one that left most people walking a slippery slope between suspicion and scandal. What's funny is that, even with all this worry, they still found ways to turn cleanliness into performance. Fancy glass cases called toilet services were displayed in bedrooms, holding brushes, powders, perfumes, and basins. These weren't just for use. They were for show, silent proof that you cared about hygiene, even if you didn't actually use them much. Having the tools was almost as important as using them. So imagine the daily scene. It's morning, you've survived your corset, endured breakfast, and now you decide to wash. You stand behind your folding screen, gingerly dabbing at your face with lukewarm water, toweling your arms until they glow pink, powdering your chest, brushing your hair into place. All the while, you're careful not to get carried away. You want to be clean enough to be respectable, but not so clean that people talk. By the end of it, you don't feel refreshed in the way we might after a shower. You feel prepared, polished just enough to face the day, covered with enough layers of clothing, powder, and restraint to keep people from guessing the truth that underneath, you're still very much human. Still sweaty, still tired, still you. But in Victorian England, being yourself wasn't the point. Looking respectable was. And so, bathing wasn't a relief. It was another performance, a slippery slope, full of awkward rituals and quiet anxieties. For every splash of water, there was a rule. For every bar of soap, there was a superstition. And for every faint whiff of lavender water, there was the silent hope that nobody would notice just how rarely you actually bathed. By now you've survived the corset, navigated the minefield of breakfast, and tiptoed through the rituals of washing without scandal. You've made it through the early part of the day. But in Victorian England, the home itself wasn't a refuge from judgment. It was another stage. Every parlour, every piece of furniture, every little decoration had the potential to carry meaning. And sometimes, even the legs of a table could be accused of indecency. Yes, you heard that right. One of the most persistent myths about Victorian life is that people were so prudish they actually dressed their furniture. Covered piano legs in ruffled skirts, hid table legs under layers of lace, even slipped pantaloons onto chairs, all to avoid the terrible risk that someone might think of human limbs. Imagine it a society so scandalized by legs that even your dining room furniture had to be properly clothed. Now, the truth is a little less ridiculous, but just as revealing. The whole idea started as a joke. A British naval officer visiting America once wrote about a schoolmistress who put bloomers on her piano legs, supposedly to protect the modesty of her students. The story got picked up, twisted around, and retold until people started to believe it was true of the English themselves. In reality, Victorian families did cover their furniture, but mostly to protect it from scratches or to show off fancy fabrics. It wasn't about shame, it was about decoration. Still, the myth stuck, and to this day we picture Victorians blushing at the sight of a table leg. But even if that particular story is exaggerated, it captures something real about the Victorian parlour. This was a space heavy with meaning. The parlour wasn't just where you drank tea or entertained guests. It was the showcase of your family's respectability. It was a stage, and everything in it was part of the performance. Think of it: heavy curtains blocking out too much light, carpets so thick they muffled footsteps, portraits of stern ancestors staring down from the walls. Furniture was arranged not for comfort, but for display. The sofa wasn't where you curled up with a book. It was where you perched with perfect posture while neighbours judged your upholstery. Even the knick-knacks on the mantelpiece mattered. A mismatched vase or a chipped figurine could spark a whole line of gossip about your taste, your finances, or your reliability as a host. And what happened in the parlour was just as important as what sat inside it. This was the arena for polite entertainment. Guests came expecting conversation, but not too much honesty. They came ready to be amused, but not in ways that might seem improper. And that's where the great Victorian tradition of parlour games came in. At first glance, parlour games sound fun, a way to pass the evening with friends and family. But in Victorian England, even games weren't really about play. They were about showing your wit, your memory, and above all, your ability to follow the unspoken rules. A simple game like charades wasn't about being silly. It was about demonstrating cleverness without looking desperate. A wrong move could leave you red-faced for months. Imagine being in that parlour, the fire crackling, tea cooling in cups, lace-draped furniture standing stiff around the edges of the room. Someone suggests a game. The minister's cat, for instance, where each person has to describe the cat with an adjective in alphabetical order. At first, it's manageable. The minister's cat is adorable. The minister's cat is bashful. But by the time you reach quixotic, you're sweating, praying no one asks you to spell it. Or maybe the group chooses charades. Not the movie guessing party game we know today, but a grueling exercise in acting out long, abstract words in multiple parts. Imagine trying to mime incomprehensible in front of a crowd of relatives with your aunt's hawk-like eyes fixed on you while everyone pretends to understand. Failure meant embarrassment. Success meant polite applause. Either way, the evening dragged on. Then there were the more mischievous games. Forfeits, where losers had to perform silly tasks. Recite a tongue twister, sing a verse, maybe even declare undying affection for a handkerchief. Humiliating, yes, but all under the guise of good fun. Of course, good fun in Victorian society came with strict limits. Laugh too loudly and you were vulgar. Refuse to laugh at all and you were cold. The parlour was a tightrope and everyone knew it. The truth is, entertainment in the Victorian home wasn't really about having a good time. It was about proving you belonged, that you could handle wit, manners, and self-control in equal measure. The parlour tested you just as much as the breakfast table or the street outside. And just when you thought you'd survived, just when you leaned back in your chair thinking, at least the furniture won't betray me, you'd notice the frills, the lace covers, the embroidered doilies, the careful way even a piano leg was dressed up, not for modesty but for display. And you'd realise in this world, even objects had to behave. That was Victorian home life, where the walls had eyes, the furniture wore skirts, and the parlour was a stage where laughter was rehearsed, games were tests, and every little detail, down to the trim on a cushion, carried weight. Home wasn't private. It was the front line of respectability. If breakfast was an exam and the parlour a stage, then afternoon tea was the crown jewel of Victorian performance. On paper, it sounds delightful, a little break between lunch and dinner, a warm cup of tea, maybe a few treats. But in Victorian England, tea wasn't about comfort. It was a discipline. It was about reputation. And for many, it was about making it through without starting a feud over whether jam or cream came first. Afternoon tea took place between 4 and 6 in the evening, those hungry hours when stomachs were growling, but no one dared admit it. The setting was always perfect, the drawing room polished, curtains drawn just enough to filter the sunlight, the silver shining so brightly you could see your own worried reflection in it. Cushions were puffed like little fortresses. Every detail whispered one word: respectability. The ritual began when the tea tray arrived, carried in like a royal guest. And what a tray it was! Porcelain cups, arranged like soldiers, saucers stacked neatly, teaspoons glinting, each with its own place. There was the teapot itself, of course, and a jug of hot water, a small milk jug. Never called a pitcher, that would have been far too ordinary. A sugar bowl with its dainty tongs, a lemon dish, and sometimes even a second teapot just for weaker blends. To the untrained eye, it looked like a simple set of dishes. To a Victorian, it was a minefield. The host poured first, moving with the kind of precision usually reserved for surgery. Guests waited, sitting up straight, legs at the perfect angle, hands folded neatly in their laps. When the tea finally reached you, the anxiety really began. Would you take sugar, milk, lemon? Each choice carried meaning. Add milk first, before the tea, and you risked silent judgment. That was considered a mistake, a little rebellion against tradition. Add too much sugar and you seemed greedy, too little and you seemed joyless. Lemon was acceptable, but never with milk. Mix the two and you weren't just breaking etiquette. You were tempting fate itself. People whispered it caused storm, plagues, and possibly hauntings. Even stirring your tea had rules. You moved the spoon in small, silent circles, careful never to clink against the sides of the cup. That tiny sound, harmless to us, was offensive in Victorian society. It meant you weren't in control, that you lacked refinement. Better to look stiff and strained than to let your teaspoon betray you. Then came the food, presented on a 3-tiered stand that seemed innocent enough, but carried its own labyrinth of etiquette. At the bottom, sandwiches with the crusts neatly cut off. Cucumber slices, so thin they were practically transparent. Maybe a whisper of butter, maybe a sliver of smoked salmon. Never anything hearty. You weren't here to eat. You were here to nibble with grace. Above the sandwiches sat the scones, and here's where the real battlefield lay. Do you put the jam first, then cream? Or cream first, then jam? Cornwall swore by one way, Devon by the other, and entire families could feud for generations over which was correct. Whichever choice you made, someone in the room would judge you for it. And the worst part, there wasn't a safe answer. All you could do was pick a side and accept the risk of eternal whispers. At the very top of the stand were the pastries. Tiny cakes, fruit tarts, biscuits so delicate they looked afraid of being eaten. They were to be approached last, and carefully. Small bites only. Never stuff an entire tart in your mouth. Never lick icing off your fingers. And never, ever drop a crumb. If you did, you ignored it completely, as though gravity itself had betrayed you, and you weren't about to acknowledge it. Conversation at tea was as tightly controlled as everything else. Safe topics included the weather, the latest novel, or perhaps a polite remark about a neighbor's garden. Dangerous topics included politics, money, illness, or, heaven forbid, scandal. Gossip was always tempting, but if you indulged too freely, you risked being seen as vulgar. So conversations were light, airy, and usually as filling as the cucumber sandwiches. Smiling was allowed, chuckling was risky, laughter was practically treason. The act of drinking itself was another performance. You didn't just lift the cup. You balanced it gracefully, pinky not extended. That was a myth, but fingers gently placed. Raise it smoothly, sip quietly, then lower it without fuss. No gulping, no sighs of pleasure. Tea was to be consumed as though it were a duty, not a delight. By the time the ceremony was over, nerves were frayed, stomachs half full, and reputations delicately balanced on whether you had stirred too loudly or layered your scone in the wrong order. Guests left with smiles plastered on their faces, exhaustion hidden under polite thank yous. Host sat back afterward, relieved that nothing catastrophic had happened. No spilled tea, no slurped sugar, no feud sparked over jam placement. And yet, for all its tension, afternoon tea became one of the most iconic parts of Victorian life. It was the moment when society came together, when people demonstrated grace under pressure, and when even a simple sip carried the weight of judgment. For the Victorians, tea wasn't just a drink. It was a performance, a chance to prove you belonged. So the next time you toss a tea bag in a mug, slouch back in a chair, and scroll through your phone while dunking a cookie, take a moment to appreciate how far we've come. You're not being silently judged by 3 ounce, a family portrait, and a tray of sugar tongs. You're not debating jam versus cream as though your reputation depends on it. You're just enjoying tea. The Victorians, they could never. If afternoon tea was a minefield, mourning in Victorian England was the Olympics of emotional restraint. Grief wasn't just a private feeling, it was a full-time job. A job with uniforms, schedules, and enough rules to make even the strictest etiquette guide look like light reading. Someone dies, and suddenly your life is dictated not by your heart, but by your wardrobe. The moment a death was announced, colour vanished. Every trace of brightness. Gone dresses, veils, jewellery, gloves, even handkerchiefs, black, and more black. Shiny black fabrics, dull matte black crepe, jet beads that gleamed just enough to remind everyone of sorrow. If you were a widow, you entered the realm of widow's weeds. These weren't weeds from the garden, but heavy mourning dresses so thick and suffocating they might as well have been portable saunas. Add in a long black veil, and you were expected to stumble through months, even years, half blinded by gauze. This wasn't a short process. Mourning came in stages, and each stage had its own rules. First was deep mourning. That meant no jewellery except jet, no smiles, no social visits, no hint of fun. You lived in shadow, sometimes for a year or more. Then came half mourning, when you were allowed to step cautiously into shades of grey or maybe muted purple, colours that suggested sorrow, but also a cautious willingness to live again, move into colour too soon, and people whispered that you didn't really care about the deceased. Stay in black too long, and you were accused of being dramatic. It was a tightrope, and no one agreed on the perfect balance. It didn't stop with clothes. Mourning seeped into the house itself. Curtains were drawn, mirrors covered so no one risked catching a glimpse of themselves smiling. Clocks stopped in somber symbolism. Pianos stayed closed, music hushed, laughter banished. Even the family dog seemed to sigh more often. Everything in the home turned heavy, quiet, and solemn. And yet this solemnity wasn't just about showing respect. It was about being seen showing respect. Mourning was public theatre. Neighbours watched. Relatives judged. That one great aunt who always knew the rules better than anyone else became the self-appointed referee of your grief. If your veil was too short, if your posture too casual at the graveside, if your thank you notes weren't bordered in thick enough black, she noticed. And she told everyone. Letters and stationery joined in the performance. You couldn't just write a note of thanks on plain paper. Oh no, mourning required black-edged stationery, every envelope bordered in shadow, every word announcing your grief to anyone who touched the letter. Even sending an invitation carried weight. The black edge reminded recipients that you were still in mourning, and they adjusted their expectations accordingly. Accessories carried meaning too. Mourning brooches became common, often holding a lock of hair from the deceased, tucked inside like a tiny relic. These keepsakes were worn close to the heart, both as proof of sorrow and as a fashionable nod to duty. Even jewellery bowed to grief, stripped of sparkle, loaded with symbolism. And while all of this might sound exhausting, for the Victorians it was serious business. To fail at mourning was worse than failing at breakfast or tea. It wasn't just embarrassing, it was insulting. Show too much joy too soon, and you risked being labelled cold, shallow, or unfeeling. Show too little recovery after years, and you risked accusations of self-indulgence. There was no winning, only surviving. Of course, mourning wasn't equal for everyone. Widows bore the heaviest burden, often expected to wear black for years. Children, siblings, cousins, all had their own timetables, each one outlined in etiquette manuals. And heaven help you if you mixed them up. To wear grey when you should still be in black was a scandal. To laugh at the wrong time. Social suicide. Imagine being at a neighbour's dinner party months after your father had passed, daring to smile at a joke about the weather. Across the table, someone gasps softly. An eyebrow lifts. Later, a letter arrives from a distant relative reminding you, ever so politely, that grief is a sacred duty. In a society where every action mattered, even your laughter was rationed. The thing is, the Victorians weren't heartless. Their rituals came from a real place of loss. Death was everywhere, illness, accidents, short life expectancies. Almost every family carried grief. Mourning gave them structure, a script to follow when emotions were overwhelming. It made grief legible to others. It allowed people to know where you stood, how long you had been grieving, and how they were expected to behave around you. In a strange way, it was both a cage and a comfort. Still, for the individual, it was relentless. To mourn was to perform every hour of the day, to wear your sorrow not just in your heart, but in your sleeves, your letters, your jewelry, your curtains, even your silence. Every sigh, every nod, every shade of fabric carried meaning. It wasn't enough to feel loss. You had to prove it again and again, until society deemed it sufficient. By the time you reached the end of mourning, you weren't necessarily healed. You were simply released from the costume, allowed to rejoin the living with a cautious splash of colour. Maybe lilac, maybe soft blue. Not joy, exactly, but permission. Permission to move forward, even if your heart still lingered in the past. So when we look back at the Victorians, draped in black, veiled and silent, it's easy to laugh at the rigidity of it all. But beneath the starch and the rules was something deeply human. The desire to honour loss, to make sense of grief, and to find a way to carry it in public without falling apart. They didn't always get it right, and their rituals often turned into burdens. But in their own way, they were trying to live with sorrow in a world where death was never far away. By now, you've learned that Victorians loved rules. Rules for eating, rules for walking, rules for grieving. But perhaps the most fascinating rules were the ones for speaking without speaking. In a society where direct words could be dangerous, people built entire hidden languages. And so Victorian social networking didn't happen on phones or over coffee. It happened through calling cards, folded corners, and bouquets of flowers that carried more drama than any text message ever could. Let's start with the calling card. Imagine trying to visit a friend, but instead of ringing the bell and waiting for them to answer, you hand over a small rectangle of pasteboard. A business card, essentially, only this wasn't just a card. It was your social arrêt compressed into 3 inches of stiff paper. The size mattered. Too large, and you looked desperate for attention. Too small, and you seemed like you had something to hide. The font mattered. No flamboyant swirls, nothing continental, and absolutely no playful serifs. This wasn't design, it was identity. A respectable calling card was plain, legible, and just a touch elegant, as though to say, yes, I exist, and yes, I know the rules. Then there was the case. You couldn't just shove cards in your pocket. They had to be stored in ivory, silver, or mother-of-pearl boxes. Each case itself said something about your taste and your status. Imagine being judged not only on your handwriting but also on the box you carried your name in. That was Victorian networking. Now, the real magic was in the folding, a corner bent down. That meant you delivered the card personally, folded lengthwise, a condolence call, folded at the top, strictly business. Each crease was a message, as clear to the Victorians as an emoji is to us. But heaven help you if you folded it wrong. A misplaced bend wasn't just awkward, it was catastrophic. It could mean the difference between being invited to dinner or being silently exiled from polite society. Once your card was delivered, it didn't vanish. Cards were displayed in trays by the front door, little silver baskets that served as a scoreboard of popularity. Too many cards meant you were in demand. An empty tray meant you were forgotten. Some families even borrowed cards from friends just to pad the tray, so no visitor would suspect their social life was barren. Even when you weren't home, your reputation sat on display for anyone who walked by. But calling cards weren't the only code. The Victorians also spoke through flowers. Floriography, they called it, the language of flowers. In a world where emotions were smothered by etiquette, a bouquet became a confession. A rose wasn't just a rose. A pink one meant gratitude. A yellow hyacinth whispered jealousy. A white lily signaled purity, or hinted that someone's days were numbered. Every colour, every bloom carried meaning, and it got complicated. 2 red roses together, a marriage proposal. 3 red roses, needy. 4, a polite request never to speak again. Flowers weren't just gifts, they were weapons, invitations, even breakups. Picture a young suitor arriving at tea, trembling as he offers a bouquet. He thinks he's chosen well, but tucked among the roses is a single yellow carnation. To us, it's just a flower. To the Victorians, it screams rejection. By the end of the night, the poor boy's reputation is in tatters, all thanks to one unlucky bloom. The drama didn't stop there. The way flowers were given mattered. Presented with the right hand meant yes, with the left meant no. A bloom pinned over the heart, love. The same flower pinned lower, near the bus line, just friendship. Imagine the chaos of misinterpretation. An innocent gesture could spark rumours, duels, or broken engagements. Whole novels could, and did, unfold from a misplaced bouquet. And, of course, gossip swirled around flowers just as much as around people. A wilted plant on display in your parlour suggested laziness, emotional instability, or even marital discord. A thriving fern, on the other hand, was proof that your household was balanced, tidy, and morally upright. Houseplants themselves became silent character witnesses. Even greenery wasn't free from judgment. What's remarkable is how much effort went into keeping things unspoken. In a society terrified of scandal, the safest path was to say everything indirectly, to let a folded card speak for your intentions, to let a bouquet declare your heart, to let a fern whisper about your inner strength. Honesty was dangerous, subtlety was survival. So, picture it. A tray of cards gleaming in the hall, a bouquet trembling in a vase, an aspidistra thriving in the corner. To us, they're objects. To the Victorians, they were messages, each one a signal, each one a clue, each one a piece of the endless performance. And in a way, it's not so different from today. We worry about the wording of a text, the tone of an email, the meaning of an emoji. They worried about folds and flowers. Different tools, same anxiety. Because at the heart of it, the Victorians wanted what we all want. To connect, to belong, to be understood. They just had to do it through codes so dense that even a simple daisy could spark a scandal. You've made it through breakfast. You've survived the parlour. You've even navigated the secret codes of flowers and calling cards. Now comes one of the trickiest parts of the day, stepping outside. Because in Victorian England, simply walking down the street wasn't casual. It wasn't just moving from point A to point B. It was a social performance, every bit as choreographed as a dance. From the moment you touched the doorknob, the questions began. Which hat are you wearing? Is your posture correct? Are your gloves spotless, sitting snug at the right angle on your wrists? Walking wasn't just walking. It was an announcement to the world: I am respectable. I belong. I know the rules. Get any of it wrong, and the neighbours noticed. And when neighbours noticed, gossip wasn't far behind. The pavement itself was divided like a silent map. The cleanest, driest section, furthest from the muck and horses, was reserved for the wealthy and well-bred. If you were a governess or a merchant's son and dared to drift into that space, the withering looks alone could send you scurrying back to your proper zone. To loiter was worse. Standing still too long meant you were up to no good. Walk too fast, and you looked like you were fleeing a scandal. walked too slow, and you seemed suspiciously idle. The trick was to move at an approved, steady pace, as though you always had a purpose but never a hurry. For women, the rules doubled. A young lady of status never walked alone. She was accompanied by a maid, a governess, or a chaperone, whose watchful presence announced her virtue. A married woman could go out without company, but it was less respectable, and she might find herself stared at, whispered about, or followed by unwanted attention. Even where you walked mattered. Strolling in Hyde Park was acceptable, provided you stuck to the proper lanes. Straying too close to the row of aristocratic carriages could mark you as presumptuous, even scandalous. Even greetings were performances. If you spotted someone you knew, you didn't just wave. Men lifted their hats with a tiny, dignified motion, accompanied by the barrassed bow of the head. Too big a flourish was vulgar, too small, and you looked arrogant. Women might incline their heads slightly or offer the faintest smile, but never too much. To smile broadly, to show teeth in public, was practically indecent. It was too familiar, too eager. A full grin could be taken as a proposal of marriage, or worse, as French behaviour. And then there were puddles. London was famous for them, great slicks of dirty water that pooled in the streets after rain or after the horses had passed. Stepping in one with the wrong foot could ruin your reputation as surely as ruining your shoes. Splashing your hem marked you as careless. Splashing someone else's clothing, especially a lady's white dress, was a social catastrophe. Offering your hand to help someone across was only polite if they were of your own class or higher. Accidentally rescuing someone below your station, that could spark rumours that lasted all season. As if the sidewalks weren't stressful enough, there was transportation to consider. Public transport in the Victorian city meant the omnibus, a horse-drawn carriage with benches crammed together so tightly you could practically count the buttons on your neighbour's coat. Climbing aboard was its own ordeal. Ladies had to be helped up, but not too eagerly. An overzealous hand could make people question her respectability. Gentlemen were expected to stand aside, hats in hand, their faces carefully neutral, as though they had never even thought about anything improper in their lives. Inside the omnibus, seating was a hierarchy. The best spots went to those who looked the part, the better sort, or at least those skilled at pretending. Middle benches were for the cautious, people who knew how to look uncomfortable but dignified. The back, that was for servants, the timid, and anyone with a cough that made others shuffle nervously away. Sitting in the wrong spot meant silent exile. No one would say anything, but every glance, every whisper, marked you as someone who didn't belong. Conversation on the omnibus was just as dangerous as silence. A few words about the weather, safe. A polite, good morning, acceptable. But anything beyond that, talking politics, religion, or, heaven forbid, personal matters, was a scandal waiting to happen. Laughter was forbidden. A chuckle, even a smile, could brand you vulgar. So you stared out the window, watching the fog roll across the city, pretending you were somewhere else, praying the journey would end soon. And when it did end, there was still one last challenge: disembarking without making contact. You rose carefully, avoiding skirts and knees, clutching your parcels, nodding politely but never too warmly. You thanked the driver, never by name, just, "Thank you, sir," and slipped away into the crowd, hoping no one had noticed the tiny misstep when you almost tripped on the stairs. For the Victorians, walking outside or taking public transport wasn't freedom, it was survival. Every gesture was loaded, every misstep was noticed. You weren't just going to the market or the park. You were navigating a social obstacle course where the reward for success was invisibility. Nobody talking about you. The punishment for failure was gossip. And gossip, as we'll see, was the deadliest game of all. So, the next time you run out to grab a coffee in sweatpants, or laugh loudly while walking down the street, or plop into a bus seat without thinking twice, remember the Victorians. Remember the tightrope they walked every day, one nod, one hat tip, one careful step at a time. Inside the walls of a Victorian house, the rules didn't relax. If anything, they tightened. Family wasn't an escape from etiquette. It was where etiquette was drilled in, day after day, until it became second nature. From the youngest child to the oldest aunt, everyone had a part to play in the grand performance of respectability. Let's start with the children. For us, childhood is often about curiosity, noise, and freedom. For the Victorians, childhood was about stillness. A child's job was not to be seen exploring, or to be heard laughing, but to sit straight-backed and silent, like a decorative porcelain doll. Mourning began with the ceremonial dressing. Imagine being 7 years old and already wrestling with dozens of buttons, stiff collars, ribbons, and starched fabrics. Shoes had to gleam like mirrors. Hair had to be parted so sharply it looked like a railway track. By the time a child was finally dressed, they'd already spent the first part of the day simply enduring. Breakfast wasn't playtime either. Children sat at their own little table under the watchful eyes of a governess or nursemaid. Their job was to eat silently, no fidgeting, no giggling, no smearing jam where it didn't belong. Topics of conversation, if allowed, were strictly limited. The weather, penmanship, maybe a polite remark about the punctuality of the family cat. Mud, bugs, and body noises were strictly off limits. Education followed, but don't picture colourful chalkboards or fun science projects. Lessons were stern, quiet, and formal. Recitations were done standing up, eyes lowered, voice calm. The goal wasn't curiosity, it was discipline. Even learning your sums came with etiquette. Say, "Please, miss," before you answered, "Thank you, ma'am," after. A correct answer mattered less than correct manners. When guests came calling, children were summoned like showpieces. They stood beside their parents in the parlour, introduced in tones usually reserved for expensive china, and were expected to recite their name, their age, maybe even a line of poetry. No talk of mud pies, no mention of frogs, no stories about falling into the duck pond. Just neat, polite, and forgettable. But behind closed doors, that's where Victorian kids let loose. Away from the watchful eyes of adults, they laughed, shouted, wrestled, even dared each other to say forbidden words like bottom. At the dinner table, in private, they were as mischievous as children anywhere. But the moment a door creaked open or a governess reappeared, the play ended. Silence and composure returned like masks slipping back into place. Now let's turn to romance. Courtship in Victorian England was not about stolen kisses or candlelit dinners. It was a dance, slow and stiff, watched over by a small army of relatives. Cupid wasn't alone. He always had a chaperone. First came introductions. You didn't simply walk up and say hello. A mutual acquaintance had to vouch for you. Ideally, someone with impressive whiskers or a stern reputation. Once introductions were made, conversation was limited to the safest topics imaginable. The weather, a cousin's health, perhaps a new type of marmalade at Fortnum's. Anything more exciting was considered dangerous. If the conversation went well, you might be permitted a supervised walk, a promenade through a park, or a slow stroll in the garden. But you were never alone. An aunt or governess followed close behind, eyes sharp, ears sharper, making sure your elbows stayed 3 inches apart. Glances were allowed, provided they were brief and quickly disguised as birdwatching. Holding hands. Absolutely scandalous. Even a brush of fingers could send the rumour mill spinning. Letters played a big role in romance. Forget emojis and texts. Victorian love was declared in 10-page handwritten letters, dripping with metaphors and carefully chosen words. I adore you became, I find our mutual appreciation of cloud formations deeply gratifying. Every word was weighed, every flourish of handwriting judged. Too ornate, and you seemed frivolous. Too plain, and you lacked feeling. Each letter might be read not only by your intended, but also by their parents, their siblings, or a nosy neighbour. Privacy was rare. Once affection was confirmed, the process sped up. Parents were summoned, contracts were discussed, expectations laid out. Engagement meant surveillance tightened even further. The couple could sit in the same room, but only with the door wide open, and only if others were present. They might exchange gifts, small, safe items like books or lockets, Nothing suggestive, nothing too personal. Break the rules, though, and the consequences were severe. A stolen kiss before engagement could ruin a young woman's reputation forever. She might be sent away to the countryside, banished under the watchful eye of stern relatives. Men risked duels, social exile, or at the very least, being scratched off invitation lists. Love wasn't just a matter of the heart, it was a matter of survival. And yet, within all the rules, feelings still found ways to bloom. Lovers passed secret notes tucked inside books. They used the language of flowers to whisper what they couldn't say aloud. They stole fleeting glances that carried more passion than hours of conversation. In a world where emotions were hidden under etiquette, even the smallest gesture could feel electric. So, within the Victorian family, life was a careful balance of silence, supervision, and performance. Children were raised to be seen, not heard. Parents enforced discipline not just to control their kids, but to protect the family's reputation. Young couples navigated love under the constant gaze of others, finding ways to express themselves through glances, letters, and codes. It may seem suffocating to us now, but to them, these rituals were the framework that kept society running. They lived inside a puzzle of rules, and for better or worse, they found ways to make life, childhood, family, love fit within it. Behind every polished parlour and carefully arranged breakfast table was an invisible army. Servants, they were the quiet machinery of Victorian homes, the people who made sure fires were lit before anyone woke, that boots gleamed like mirrors, that meals appeared as though by magic. And yet, their most important job wasn't cooking or cleaning. It was disappearing. A good servant was practically invisible. They moved silently, hands still, eyes lowered, never speaking unless spoken to. They were expected to anticipate needs without ever drawing attention to themselves. Meals had to arrive at the exact moment hunger struck. Fireplaces had to be stoked before the master of the house even realized he was cold, and boots had to shine so brightly that a family member could check their hair in them. But the servant delivering the boots, they might as well not exist. Hierarchy ruled even below stairs. The butler was king, the housekeeper queen, both presiding over the rest with quiet authority. The cook was powerful too. Cross her, and you risked meals that hinted at her displeasure. Footmen, chosen as much for looks as for skill, were expected to glide through rooms like moving furniture, always handsome, always silent. The scullery maid, youngest and lowest in rank, spent endless hours scrubbing, peeling, and sweating in kitchens she rarely escaped. For servants, invisibility wasn't just etiquette. It was survival. And yet, behind closed doors, laughter returned. In cramped quarters below stairs, servants swapped stories of their employers' oddities, snickered at whispered scandals, and shared leftover scones. Downstairs, life had its own rhythm, far freer than the stiff formality above. But once morning came, invisibility returned, as ironclad as the corset laces upstairs. It wasn't just servants who had rules. Even the pets were part of the performance. Owning a dog or cat was fashionable, but they weren't allowed to behave like, well, animals. Dogs were brushed until they sparkled, perfumed with lavender water, adorned with ribbons. They had to walk in step with their owners, no barking at horses, no chasing tails, no sniffing anything unseemly. Cats were permitted to purr softly and nap in sunbeams, but heaven forbid they knocked over a vase. Even parrots, popular in some homes, had their vocabulary carefully censored. No gossip, no politics, nothing vulgar. Imagine trying to train a bird not to repeat your secrets at tea. And then there were the plants. Yes, even houseplants became part of the silent performance. Ferns, poms, orchids, all arranged in ornate glass cases called Wardian cases, polished until they gleamed. A healthy plant suggested moral stability, discipline, good housekeeping. A wilted one, proof of laziness, maybe even emotional instability. Neighbours would notice, they always noticed. Guests would comment. A plant wasn't just decoration, it was a character witness. Entire reputations wilted with an aspidistra. But perhaps the sharpest blade in the Victorian household wasn't the maid's polished silver or the butler's iron stare. It was gossip. Gossip was a blood sport, played mostly in parlours over tepid tea, but its echoes rang through every hallway. The slightest slip, a wrinkled glove, an overwatered fern, a servant caught smiling too much, became fuel for whispers. Nobody said things outright. Instead, it was raised eyebrows, meaningful sighs, compliments laced with poison. How clever of you to wear last year's colour. So thrifty. One comment like that could sting worse than an outright insult. Men weren't immune. Their gossip drifted in clouds of pipe smoke, cloaked in solemn tones. Did you hear about Fortescue's investments? Most curious. Translation: he's ruined, and his wife will be reusing last season's hats. For women, gossip came dressed as polite chatter. Did you notice Lady Harrow's gown? Sounded like a question, but it was really an execution. The art of surviving gossip was mastering the poker face. Smile blandly, nod wisely, never let them see you flinch. Some women became legends for their skills. They could ruin reputations with nothing more than a cough at the right moment. Whole households trembled at their judgment. And yet, gossip wasn't just cruelty. It was currency. It was how reputations rose and fell, how alliances were made and broken. In a society where honesty was risky, gossip became the underground network everyone relied on, even as they pretended to despise it. So picture it upstairs, a family sitting stiffly in the parlour, plants thriving, pets polished, servants silent as shadows. Downstairs, maids whispering stories, footmen rolling their eyes, the cook muttering about undercooked pheasants, and in the air above it all, the hum of gossip. Every glance, every whisper, every sigh carrying the weight of judgment. The Victorian home wasn't just a house. It was a stage layered with performances. Servants playing the part of ghosts, pets pretending to be ornaments, plants posing as moral proof, and family members doing their best to keep the whole production from collapsing under the weight of gossip. And so, we reach the end of our walk through Victorian life. From corsets to cutlery, from gossip to grief, from ferns to funerals, we've seen just how many invisible scripts guided every move. Looking back, it almost feels like the Victorians were actors trapped in the longest, most exhausting play ever written. A play where the audience never left, and the curtains never came down. It's tempting to laugh at it all. The layers of fabric, the endless spoons, the panic over table legs. To us, it feels absurd. Why worry about whether cream goes before jam, or whether your fern is thriving, or whether your hat tip is too enthusiastic? But for the Victorians, these things weren't absurd. They were survival. In a world shaken by industrial change, crowded cities, and uncertain futures, etiquette was their armor. It gave them order in chaos, belonging in a sea of strangers, dignity in a time when life itself could be fragile. Think about it, disease was everywhere, medicine was unreliable, poverty lurked just outside the door. Death wasn't a rare intruder, it was a regular visitor. And when you can't control the big things, life, death, fortune, you cling tightly to the little ones. You control the way you butter toast. You control the color of your dress in grief. You control the precise angle of your bow on the street. It was exhausting, yes, but it was also comforting, like following a script when you don't know what else to say. And beneath all that starch and restraint, the Victorians were still just people. People who laughed behind closed doors, who bent the rules when no one was watching, who found secret ways to love, to gossip, to breathe a little freer. They may have been laced into corsets or weighed down with mourning veils, but they were still human, full of quirks, longings, and quiet rebellions. That's why their world feels so strange to us, and yet oddly familiar. Because don't we still do it? We may not wear crinolines or worry about the wrong spoon, but we still put on performances. We still worry about appearances, about what people think, about making the right impression. Our scripts are different. Emails instead of calling cards, emojis instead of flowers, Instagram plants instead of aspidistras. But the need is the same, to belong, to be respected, to survive in a world that can feel overwhelming. So tonight, as you tuck yourself into bed without a corset, without a chaperone, without a governess scolding you for laughing too loudly, take a moment to be grateful. Grateful for hot showers instead of lukewarm strip washers. Grateful for simple spoons. Grateful that you can sneeze at breakfast without having to write an apology letter bordered in black. And maybe, just maybe, whisper a thank you to the Victorians. They endured all that stiffness and strangeness, all that judgment and gossip, and somehow still found ways to live, to love, to joke, to survive. Their resilience gave us the freedoms we enjoy now. Freedoms they couldn't have imagined, like lounging in sweatpants, sipping tea from a mug, and laughing out loud without scandal. So, let the heavy velvet curtains close on the Victorian stage. Let the gas lamps dim, the ferns wilt quietly in their pots, the sideburns rest in peace, and drift into sleep knowing that history, no matter how strange or starchy, is filled with people just like us, trying, fumbling, enduring, and occasionally breaking the rules with a smile. Good night, and may your dreams be free of corsets, spoons, and scandalous table legs.